And hello, everyone, and welcome to another Talk Within the Nine-Sided Circle, brought to you by the Nine-Sided Circle and sponsored by No Such Topika. Today, we're going to be talking about time and what it means. But before we do that, if you are watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing to the channel. We would like to get a lot of subscriptions because we are told that you are nobody unless you have a lot of subscriptions. And while we enjoy being nobody, we would like to be more successful at it. So, subscribe to our channel. Hit the little bell button if you'd like. That's the little button down there. You don't have to do it right now. You could do it after the video. You could do it during the video. You could do it before the video. And if you hit the bell button, then you will be notified every time we put content up, which is at least once a week. And yeah, hit the like button. Let us know if you like this. Make a comment. Tell us about your thoughts about time. Or hit the dislike button. Tell us what you hate. We're open to all sorts of feedback. So anyway, there is that. So back to time. So when I was a young fella in college, coming up and studying anthropology, which was my undergrad major, we ran across a book called, what was it? Language, Thought, and Reality by Benjamin Lee Whorf. And in that book, he noticed that he studied the Hopi language. The Hopi is a tribe of Native Americans, an indigenous population which have lived on their reservation in what is now Arizona for 1,000 years. They speak a Uto-Aztecan language, and Whorf noticed that their language did not handle time the way that we in the West handle time. And yet they were able to account for every perceivable phenomena in the universe and did it quite fine. Out of this came what was called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is called the relativistic hypothesis, which says that there is no innate hardwiring for language, and we change things, we perceive differently if we grow up speaking different languages. Now, this has since been supplanted by the absolutist viewpoint championed by Noam Chomsky, who says, yeah, we're hardwired for language and everybody is going to experience certain things like time in the same way. My sense is that this is more of a political fight than an actual scientific one. And they are working hard to refute each other's hypotheses, and I really don't care. I think that Whorf is more accurate than Chomsky, and I say that from having grown up speaking a couple of different languages, one of which has like no relationship to English at all, and then traveling around and learning more. And I find that I think differently in each of these languages, that different things are more prominent or less prominent depending on what language I'm thinking in. The last language I learned was Kiswahili, which is a language spoken by a great number of people in Eastern Africa. Kiswahili means the Swahili language. And it's a bit of a trade tongue, but it is not related to English. It is a Bantu language with a lot of Arabic loans. And we're going to get to that because they have a totally different way of handling time than we do in the West. So, time. Is time fixed. Here's a question for you. What is time? Can anybody give me a definition of time? Don't everybody jump up at once. No? Okay. We may never know then. So we used to think that time was pretty straightforward. It plodded along at the same rate, and we were kind of stuck going in it. Then Einstein came along, and he noticed that time is relative to velocity. And he noticed that a person as their velocity increases, time slows down for them relative to things traveling at not that velocity. And this was actually tested back in the 1970s when a bunch of scientists put an atomic clock on a plane and basically flew it around the world as fast as they could go. And when they got to the end of their trip, they checked it against a stationary atomic clock. And sure enough, the two clocks no longer matched up. Now, this experiment has been duplicated several times since then. And it shows us that time is definitely relative to your velocity. And as you approximate the speed of light, time begins to slow down for you in relation to everything around you. So you hop on a rocket ship, you go flying out to Alpha Centauri at near the speed of light, and then you turn around and come flying back. You're so close to the speed of light that it only takes you 4 years to make the entire trip. But when you get back, 4 years have not passed on Earth. Wonder of wonders, I forget the exact number of years it passed on Earth, but it's a lot. So you have traveled in time relative to everybody else, or everybody else has traveled in time relative to you, which is pretty weird. Now, who here feels time as being the same all the time? Anyone?
So you're talking about duration, not sequence, right? I mean,
I'm talking about the subjective perception at this point.
subjective perception of duration, right?
Yeah. You know, you're sitting in an office waiting for somebody to call you to go see a doctor, and you look at your clock and it seems like 10 minutes have gone by, and you look and it's only been 2 minutes. That is a subjective experience of duration.
Correct.
You're having great amounts of fun, and you look up at your clock and an hour and a half has gone by and it only feels like 15 minutes.
Yeah, and there's certainly subjectivity on that. I don't see the same thing happening. I mean, it's not a reversal sequence that goes on. You know, it's not like suddenly what came, you know, if A became before B, now it becomes B coming before A. I mean, that
gets a little trickier.
Yeah.
That seems to actually be able to happen. I know that recently there was an experiment where scientists used a particle accelerator to create a mini wormhole, and through various arcane processes changed the duration of time at each end of the wormhole. So the two ends of the wormhole, which are basically in the same space, were not in the same time. This is stuff that we only do at the quantum level right now. Time gets incredibly weird at the quantum level.
But as far as your question about the experience of time,
Yes.
I mean, I've certainly experienced the sense of duration as expanding and shortening. I've never experienced sequence as flipping itself around.
You've never had déjà vu?
I've had déjà vu, but I don't consider that to be a sequence flip. I consider that to be more a memory issue. You know,
What's the difference?
I would assume that in the one case there's an intersubjective event that happens, and the other case is basically just a subjective memory, basically.
Here is a thought. Everything that you experience as past is just a memory. It does not exist.
True.
Everything you experience as future is just an idea, and it doesn't exist.
True.
So what we can say exists is now. And now can be pretty weird as it is. So,
and the now becomes an interesting question, because the now certainly has still sequence in it, right?
for us,
Well, as opposed to what, a grasshopper? I mean, I'm not sure.
as opposed to objectively. The latest thought, and I was checking on this earlier today to make sure that I was following the latest science, is that now seems to move along smoothly, whereas people seem to take photographs of now. So there's a distinct difference between our internal perceptions and what may or may not be going on objectively, which is something that we really don't actually ever get to know about, because we can't seem to know the objective while we're stuck in this body inside our own selves.
I guess what I get fascinated by is something simple like being able to hear a melody, which is basically now experiencing a sequence of tones, which is really kind of weird when you think about it, you know, because it's, I mean, you're not experiencing a chord, you're not experiencing a single note, you're experiencing a melody strung out, presumably in what we would call time. So a sequence of tones. Otherwise, you would be hearing a melody. You'd be just hearing a chord or a single note.
Yeah, and what may be happening is that you are, in fact, only hearing a single note or a single chord, and you're remembering the ones that came before, stitching them together in your mind.
Yeah, but there's a difference between my remembering what the beginning of the symphony was like and remembering what this particular tune was like. In other words, there's a qualitative difference, at least in my experience, between...
But is it really different?
Really different. Define what you mean by really different.
I mean, you say that you experience it as different, which is,
Right.
is definitely a valid thing, but what is going on cognitively?
Yeah. Don't know. I mean, not sure anyone knows, really. Yeah.
You had a thought, Nancy?
Yeah, I was thinking that it seems like a decision to remember the beginning of the symphony, whereas the melody, just the normal thing is to hear it as a melody without any effort.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and that may be a different form of memory.
Mhm. Also, I'm not sure that hearing a melody is different from hearing a sentence.
It's not. I mean, for me, melody is just a very simple and clear
Yeah.
example, you know. But yeah, a sentence would be the same issue there.
Yeah, and this is what gets so interesting about the concept of time, is that we are doing things with it all the time. One of the things that is most interesting is that in the Indo-Iranian languages, of which English is one, we tend to view time as an object. In other languages like Hopi, Navajo, Apache, time is viewed as a verb or an adverb, as an action.
Can you give us an example of that difference?
It's really, really hard without teaching you a bunch of the language. But let me see if I can come up with. As I understand it, and I'm not an expert on Hopi by any means. As I understand it, rather than talking about a person being at a particular place in time, time being a process, two people can be born in the same instant. And 20 years later, one of them will be perceived as being older than the other.
And not just in the sense of being older and wiser, right? But
in whatever that means. And my sense is that it has to do with life experience.
That would sort of fit the older and wiser mold, you know. And that, I think there's a lot of truth to that, because one of the things I certainly noticed under certain psychedelic experiences is that as a whole, you become aware of a whole bunch of events. I mean, the event horizon is thicker almost, and that seems to be experienced as a dilation of time. It takes forever to get from this intersection to that intersection just because there's so much stuff going on in that. So many.
Yeah, and that's something that we are actually going to address tonight, because that's very important.
Okay.
I
will shut up.
No, don't shut up. Keep talking. This is kind of fun. I mean, everybody else is sitting back not saying anything, which worries me, but you and I are having fun. So Aaron says, been argued that dreams are not experienced in the way we experience events when we are awake. It is when we are awake that we remember a dream as a series of events. This is probably true, or at least it's a good model. We also note that the subjective experience of time in the dream does not match the experience of time on the clock outside of the dream, because you can have a dream that feels like it goes on for 4 or 5 hours, and it's actually a couple of minutes in clock time, or as I like to call it, consensus time. And that gets us to the idea of time distortion, which is what Ilmar was referring to. As a hypnotist, I've played a lot with time distortion. You can put a person in a trance and have them have a subjective experience of an hour in 5 minutes of clock time. That's not even hard.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, I was a couple of years ago. I was spending an extended weekend with Jean Houston, and one of the tricks that she likes to play is sort of say, "Okay, I'll put you in this, talk you into this state where you're gonna, in 5 minutes, essentially do a year's worth of work on this project, basically." And you know, to some degree, that turns out to be true. I mean, you can actually seem to accomplish more. I was never very good at that, but I mean, some of the people.
Yeah, it takes practice.
Yeah.
Aaron observes, I've had dreams that take place over several minutes or hours only to wake up and realize that I've been choked out in training or competition. Fortunately, only a few times. And that's a good example of time distortion. So, Milton H. Erickson, MD, the guy who founded the school of hypnosis that I practice, was invited to train the Olympic shooting team. I think it was the Olympic team. It was either the Olympic team or one of the military teams. But in listening to what he did with them, basically he created a trigger for them to go into a time-distorted state where they had all the time in the world subjectively to aim and fire in mere seconds of clock time. And interestingly, that year they took the gold, so it must have helped somewhere along the line. And this is something in martial art that is very, very interesting and very useful. Most people hit this state accidentally. You might be sparring and it seems like you have all the time in the world to counter your opponent's techniques. So much time, in fact, that you can kind of see what they're going to do before they do it. And this is called a flow state. And time dilation and flow state is a very real thing.
And do you have a model of what's actually happening in that sort of situation?
I
I certainly believe that happens. I've experienced some of it, but I don't really understand what's happening, how it's working.
That's a really good question. I have a model,
Okay.
Which I want to address in a few minutes. And it's a slightly whimsical model, but it's nevertheless one that I have been working on since the early 2000s. I was just reading an account about this very, very thing that I wrote back in 2004. And it's about a sparring match. And as a matter of fact, I should read it to you. This was brought on by the fact that this particular sparring match, which happened probably in 1995 or 96, is still being talked about. And it's famous for my opponent stopping in the middle and saying, "You're fighting me like I'm a big guy." And he comes up to my chin maybe. And so let me give you the story. Even many years ago, I was introduced by a mutual friend to a fellow who had just started out on a career as a writer in the area of self-defense. He was a likable enough kid, though he had a very cocky attitude and tended to focus on himself a great deal. He made up for it by being witty and personable. He had come out with a book on knife fighting just before we met. We talked over the course of months, meeting frequently at the house of our mutual friend. We obviously talked a lot about things martial, as it was an interest for both of us. He was not familiar with Indonesian or Filipino martial arts, and I had been offering my opinion that they had a lot to offer somebody who had an interest in blade-based fighting. His interest was definitely piqued, but he was a little dubious about what I was saying, as it sort of went against what he had come up with in the way of his own theories. One day we decided that he needed to experience what I was talking about and see how it worked for him. Now, you need to understand that this was an entirely friendly situation. It was not a challenge match or anything like that. Neither of us wanted to or had any intention of hurting the other. It was a friendly sparring session to put the experience to the theory. No winner, no loser. So we repaired to the backyard and it played for a bit. He discovered that I was accurate at what I was saying, and we sparred for a few minutes. From the outside, what someone would have seen would have been something like this. My acquaintance and I squared off and began our engagement. I slipped his traps. moved in close to him and made a few touches while redirecting his line of engagement. After a couple of minutes of this, he stepped back and gave me the WTF look and uttered the now famous line, "Dude, you're fighting me like I was a big guy." Well, I'm 6'2", weighed close to 200 pounds, and the other guy was quite a bit shorter than me. So he was, I suppose, expecting me to play a distance game. It was, in fact, it may have in fact puzzled him a bit that I tended to play a close game. But that was not the reason that he was so disconcerted by the experience, and he was, by his own account. Think about it for a moment. The guy was a fairly competent fighter, and being small, he was used to working in close. And the fact that I could move in and press him should have given him no more than a moment's pause. Getting a message from Kyle here. I never did tell him why he was so thrown off by our engagement, and he drew the wrong conclusion from it, even though his conclusion was accurate as far as it went. Here is a secret. Kyle says, "Hi, everyone." The person who wins an encounter, whether it is a fight or sparring or mugging, is most often the person who recovers more quickly from surprise, shock, and failure. I was able to disconcert the guy and slip in on him because I was slicing time more thinly than he was. Now, there's nothing mystical about this. It is a matter of how much attention and flexibility a person can apply to conflict, how much a person can stay in the moment and not be pushed into thinking about the encounter. Here's the inner workings of the encounter. First, knowing that eventually we would play together, I had paid attention to everything the guy told me about his training. A fair amount of street, a bit of military CQC, and a little Wing Chun. I had watched him move and studied him as he taught some of his stuff. I paid a lot of attention to the patterns of chronic tension he held. So I went into the session knowing a lot more about him than he did about me. To slice time thinly, you have to stay in the moment of the encounter. You have to work within your breath. You have to let thinking give way to sensing. Then you can recover from being surprised by things not going the way you want quickly. I know this may sound semi-mystical, but it's not. This is usually not enough, though. You have to get the other guy to do the exact opposite. And that's what I did with my acquaintance to throw him off and disconcert him. Good fighters tend to fight heuristically. That is, they follow unconscious rules of thumb that they have developed through constant drilling of technique. This is an effective strategy in that one can respond quickly to a threat. There is a downside to this, though. The drills become habit. And if a habit is interrupted, the person has to recalibrate, and this takes time. The more a person has to recalibrate, the more thickly they slice time. So when we engaged, I gave him a strike that he reacted to with a lapsao, which is a kind of a block from Wing Chun. But I rolled the lop and touched him in the ribs. As he experienced his technique failing, he had to reset. And this gave me a moment to press in closer and disrupt him even more. He kept failing. As he kept failing, he did what most people do. He started bracing. That is to say, he began holding his breath and locking his muscles. This, of course, slowed him down even more and allowed me to both press him, destabilize him, and make his techniques fail. This, of course, leads to a downward spiral, and he was spending more and more time thinking about how to respond to what I was doing. There was also an emotional component that was working in my favor. He had a lot of ego involvement in being a fighter, and having his skills not work unbalanced him at the self-image level. When that happens, a person can spend a lot of time thinking about things. Here's another secret. The moment you take time to think about things in a fight, you're likely to lose. My acquaintance, like a lot of fighters, carried a huge amount of chronic tension in his body, which came out when he was put under stress, making him very inefficient. He made up for this by putting a lot more energy into his technique, causing his breath to degenerate. A good fighter, especially one who focuses on drilling limited skill sets, usually never learns the trick of slicing time thinly. This is too bad, as it has a limit that is never really overcome. How do you overcome the limitation? Free the body and the breath. Balance drills with sparring, with uncooperative opponents. Learn to let breath power movement. Live at the level of constant surprise as often as you can so that you can learn to be comfortable with it. What happened to my acquaintance? His star rose. He embraced fame. So, there you have the story. So what do you see in that? Now, this is a martial story, and I know everybody here is not a martial artist, but I want you to think about this for a moment. I stole the concept of slicing time, by the way, from a book called The Thief of Time by Terry Pratchett. Brilliant book. Everybody should read it. So, what do you think? A lot of Scott's on in Peter Ralston. There's a touch of Scott in there. I don't know about Peter Ralston. I only ever saw his stuff on telephone poles in Berkeley back in the 80s. Yes, Aaron, absolutely right. Drill to spar, but don't spar by drilling. Unless you want to fail every time. So, the idea of slicing time. Now, this is, what I noticed is that human beings seem to view the now in still images that they roll really, really fast past them. Much like a movie reel is, if you're looking at a film reel, it's 24 frames per second. It's 24 still pictures, and your mind puts those still pictures together as movement. The pictures are not moving. You're just looking at a bunch of still images. And I came up with a theory. I postulate, and this is metaphor, by the way. This is not this is not anything that I want you to take as anything other than a way to talk about this. So, we know from philosophical exploration that consciousness is intentional. You all know that, right?
Why don't you give us a clear idea what you mean by saying consciousness is intentional?
I mean, you are the Buddha that makes the grass green. I mean that you put together how you perceive your reality as opposed to your reality being given to you and you just receive it passively. Right. There's lots of ways to experience this. I highly recommend Experimental Phenomenology by Don Idy. He spends a good portion of the book demonstrating the intentionality of consciousness. So, you all know that at the quantum level, we have particles. Gluons, muons, and all of that. You know, we have the photon, which is, you know, the smallest bit of light you can have. We have electrons, we have protons, all of this kind of stuff. I've hypothesized that there must be a particle that human beings emit called an intenton, or an intention, which is the smallest unit of attention or the smallest unit of awareness that you can put on the present moment. And I would say that every time Kyle is very unhappy that she's not here with us. I would say that every time these particles hit a moment of now, it makes a photograph that is reflected back to you. The number of times that this happens depends on how quickly or how in what detail you perceive present moments or a sequence of present moments. You all know how to do a very, very slow motion video, right? Or not. I will tell you.
Mm-hmm.
You have a video camera, a movie camera, and we'll talk about film because it's more apparent there. The standard for film is 24 frames per second in America, 25 in Europe. So if I take a movie, if I film a movie at 100 frames per second, and then I slow it down to 25 frames per second, I see everything in slow motion. The more slices of time I have, the more time I have to perceive each element of the event that I'm experiencing. And I like I said, I hypothesize that we do these with particles called attentions. And my tongue is firmly in my cheek as I say that. Don't take this seriously. Just take it as metaphor. So, your experience of time, your subjective experience of time is going to be in great detail related to the number of slices, the number of frames per minute that you are experiencing. Does that make sense?
Sort of, but it seems very odd that time seems to go by quickly when you're enjoying yourself and presumably noticing the things you're enjoying.
That does seem odd, and I invite you to experiment with that and figure out why that is. Because in my experience, when that happens, external time goes by quickly, but my internal experience of it is that it's a long time. It's the difference between clock time and experienced time.
Yeah, certainly in my experience, as I mentioned before, the density of events that I notice, I guess.
Yeah, so I would say the density of your experiencing.
Right. You know, it is definitely affects my perception of duration of that time.
Yeah.
And the more dense that is, the longer it seems to have time with it subjective time has passed.
Yeah, Mr. Gurdjieff talks about taking impressions.
Okay.
And he notices that the more impressions you take, the more clearly you remember something.
But I wonder if that's true, actually, because are you taking in more impression? It's not like you're taking more photographs of the same object, right? I mean, it's almost like there are more events happening, and those events are slightly different from each other, at least.
Well, let's assume that you are moving through your timeline. You're following the arrow of time, as the physicists would say, at a constant rate. And during that, you are usually, say you take 25 frames per second of that constant rate of your experience of moving along the arrow of time.
Mm-hmm.
If you take 50 frames of experience during the same duration, then you have more information to work with.
But isn't it also in part a question of what you're attending to in those frames? If
Yes.
you're attending to one of the same thing, each of those frames, it doesn't really enrich your experience.
What you're attending to is your experience. That's all you can attend to.
Right. Yes, but obviously your field of experience includes things that you're focusing on and things that are peripheral. And it seems like
this may be why you get the experience of time, clock time going by very fast if you are enjoying something a lot, though it seems to you like it's been a long time.
Right. But what I'm suggesting is that in order for that phenomenon to work that way, each of the frames has to be slightly different. In other words, you're not experiencing the same frame again, as opposed to again and again.
The only way you could experience the same frame again and again and again is if time had stopped.
Well, or if the thing has not changed in that period of time.
But we're talking about time, so everything is changing. Nothing doesn't change through time.
Right, but in a relative degree, I mean, there can be a fairly constant piece of your experience and a much more rapidly changing piece of your experience.
Yeah.
And, for example, I'm thinking of experience of watching a flower. Okay, and under certain conditions, that experience of seeing that flower becomes a very, very rich experience. And I think what makes it rich is that I'm becoming aware of more aspects of that flower, or more qualities of that flower. Not that I'm seeing
time is still progressing.
Exactly. But it's because I'm getting an expanded view of the flower that it seems like that richness develops. If that flower
expanded view is, in my thinking, you taking more slices of that flower as you progress along your arrow of time.
Right. But those slices are different in an interesting way from each other. I mean, what I'm arguing for is that at least what I think I'm arguing for is that there needs to be a richness of the experience itself, not just a quantity of frames.
Define richness, because for me, richness is the quality of the frames.
The quantity
or the quantity of the frames. If I have a rich experience, I am experiencing that deeply. I'm awake to everything more frequently than not. Remember, each time your attention reflects off an object in your awareness, and again, it's all metaphor, you are experiencing that. You are experiencing that object.
Yeah.
If it happens a lot, then your experience becomes rich because you are experiencing it very, very deeply.
You know, it seems to me that that's an experimentable question. You know, in other words, we put up a white sheet, put a black dot in the center of it now, and you attend to that black dot. If you attend to it for 5 minutes, okay, and if
Haven't you ever done that?
what?
Haven't you ever?
Anyway, let me finish.
Yeah.
If that black dot does not change, I would hypothesize that there isn't a particularly increased richness of experience. If what you're observing does change in those 5 minutes, then your experience has become
Does
richer.
the black dot have to change, or do you have to change?
The experience has to change, which is a intersection
Who is experiencing?
between you and the black dot.
The black dot is not experiencing anything. It's a black dot.
No, but you
are the experiencer. Remember, this goes back to the intentionality of consciousness.
Yeah.
You are experiencing the black dot.
Yeah.
The black dot is just something. It's there.
Right.
It is your experience of it that is defining it. So the richness of your experience of that black dot will be dependent on how much attention you have on that black dot. That was like one of the first meditation techniques I ever learned. One of my teachers put a dot in front of me, drew a dot on a mirror and said, focus on this to the exclusion of everything else. And I did. And it was a very rich experience after I got the hang of it.
Because you were projecting onto it, right?
I wasn't projecting anything. I was just focusing onto it.
So what made it rich for you? What subjectively made it rich for you, aside from your theory that you had more?
My experience of it made it rich for me.
But give me an example.
My experience of being with it. It's hard to give you an example because English begins to fail at this point. Being present to that dot was internally a very rich experience for me.
Right. And I think I know what you mean. I think I've had similar experiences, but what changes there is my internal sense, in a sense, my sense of beingness. Changes.
What else is there, though?
Well, look.
What else do you have?
What else is there except everything, right? What we're trying to do is to analyze a piece of it and see if we can get some insight into it.
Yeah, I'm suggesting to you that, you're taking the existentialist position here, putting primacy on the existence. I'm taking the transcendentalist position of putting primacy on consciousness. And that is where we are mismatching on this. I deny the primacy of existence.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're that much mismatching. For me, it's simply I would love to understand in detail what goes on in that phenomenon. And
the only way to do that is to experience it and then step back and bracket it and do a phenomenological reduction of it.
And what I'm suggesting for you is to give us an account of that reduction, which you presumably have done. And it sounds like the change has not occurred so much to the degree we can distinguish the black dot from the perception of the black dot, the change has not occurred so much in the black dot as in your perception of it and your perception of other stuff that's going on.
I will suggest to you that the black dot changes over time, just as my perception of the black dot changes over time.
Yeah.
But the changes over time in the black dot can be measured scientifically in that it will make needles move. The changes in my perception is much, much harder to put science to. And the main reason that I'm not giving you the phenomenological reduction of that experience right now is because we're running out of time.
Okay.
It would take a good hour to go through it step by step.
Okay.
Something that I should write out for everybody.
I will quit pushing that point.
And I wanted to talk about very, very briefly different perceptions of time. For me, one of the biggest changes was when I moved to Tanzania, because the Kiswahili model of time is totally different than ours. The first hour of the day is not 12 midnight. The first hour of the day would usually be equivalent to 7 a.m., but is actually the point where the sun is completely above the horizon. Since the Brits got in there and mucked everything up, they have made it more artificial. But their time works the 12 hours of the day and the 12 hours of the night. The 12 hours of the day start when the sun is completely up. And the last bit of the sun comes above the horizon and goes for 12 hours, and then it becomes the 12 hours of the night, which in modern times is 7 p.m. So we started this at the first hour of the night, according to Kiswahili time. And they will break it up further into the hours of the morning, the hours of the afternoon, the hours of the evening, the hours of the night, and the hours of sunrise. And it's a totally different way of counting the hours. It took me a few weeks to get used to doing that. And everybody understands Western calendar time there because they kind of have to, because it's been forced on them. But my impression of most of the Africans was that they liked their way better. So, what changes would this make in the way you perceive the world? Rather than going, oh, it's 7 a.m., go, oh, it's the first hour of the day. You would say in Kiswahili, sa moja asubuhi, which means sa means time or hour, moja means one, asubuhi means morning. So 1 or hour first morning, 7 a.m. At 4 p.m., it becomes sakumi jioni, which means hour 10 afternoon. At 7 p.m., you go back to samoja, which is hour 1. Usiku. Usiku means evening. And at 4 a.m., it is sakumi al-faraji, which is the 10th hour at sunrise or at dawn. Dawn being defined as you have light in the sky, but you don't see the ball of the sun.
Okay, so that's a different way of a different convention for facilitating simultaneity, essentially, of
Yes.
two people arriving at the same place. But now you're suggesting that in addition to that, it changes your experience of the world. And
Yeah.
I'm curious how it changed your experience of the world.
And in my experience, it did. When I was able to think in this model, I experienced the day very much differently.
In what way?
I was more aligned with the solar cycle. You know, when you wake up and of course, you know, Tanzania, at least the part that I was in, is pretty close to the equator. So Uh, you don't get a lot of changes in the length of day and light like you would, say, in Michigan or Norway or Washington, places like that. So it experientially felt different in that my body understood, oh, this is the beginning, which is something that I could never feel with midnight being the start of the day. Midnight as the start of the day seems extremely arbitrary. It always has to me. So it allowed me to align more with my environment, which is to say it was a more natural method. Mustaqim, do you know if there was an Indonesian conception of how to tell time that was different than after the Dutch came in and mucked everything up? Some based on Islamic time. Based on the lunar calendar. Yeah, lunar calendars are fun. They'll keep you confused. Yep, the day starts at sunset in most Islamic time, which is another comfortable model, at least for me. So there we have another thing to think about is there is no one universal way to mark time. And this is where I get into saying that time is a con job that culture has subjected us to. The idea that there are hours that we have to watch in order to know where we are in the universe makes no sense from a certain perspective. And I point out that lots and lots of people for lots and lots of centuries have been able to arrive at the same place at more or less the same time without using clocks. So simultaneity, it can be a thing without the Western conception of hours, minutes, and seconds. Hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, microseconds, nanoseconds, all of these are good for measuring stuff, measuring duration scientifically. They aren't good for other things.
We need somebody from Switzerland to chime in here.
Stereotyping those poor Swiss. So this is basically what I have to offer as thoughts on time. That your internal perception of time is probably what matters the most, that it is quite mutable, that the way it changes has to do with the amount of attention that you put on each present moment, or on the present moment as you slide along your arrow of time. That the quantum realm is so weird that I don't even want to talk about it, because it just does too many crazy things, including the same particle arriving at the same place at two different times. And that's one explanation for the double slit experiment, if you guys know what that is. Oh, it's the same particle. It just showed up at 2 different times. Magic, yes. So here's a thought. If you can dilate time through being able to slice time more thinly, to take more impressions within the present moment, what does that mean for you?
Effectively a longer lifespan.
Yes, I agree, but why do you think that?
Because you're noticing more, you have more subjective time.
Yes. Yeah, if we assume that at some objective level we are traveling at a more or less same velocity most of the time, that means we're going to get from the beginning to the end of our life in a specific chunk of time. Within that, our subjective experience has a lot to do with the quality of our life and how rich it is. And every moment that you spend in oblivion is a moment that you waste of your life.
The other thing is you can be more effective because you notice more.
Yes. Yeah, if you're taking a lot more slices of the present moment, then you will be able to see more stuff around you. And that has to do with how your attention focuses. Well, that's what I got. This was a little bit of the Ilmar and Mushtaq show tonight, which personally I always enjoy.
So are you going to now have a talk on attention? Because that seems to be the other hand.
I think I have done talks on attention.
Well, you have. I guess you have. That's true.
I can do more talks on attention. I tried to solicit ideas for topics, and I got a couple. I'm waiting for Kyle to be here to do the one on charisma, because I want her here for that, because her experience will be extremely useful.
But yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I raised that is because, I mean, in regard to Nancy's comment that it provides a richness to life. I mean, the richness seems to have, you can analyze it in 2 different components. One is the number of frames in your language, and the other one would be what it is that you're attending to in each of those frames. You know? So, and those 2 seem to be slightly different dimensions, which together create the richness, right?
There are probably at least 3 dimensions that create the richness, if you want to divide it up that way.
And the third one being?
I'm not sure yet.
Okay. Just because 3 is a good number. All right, good enough.
3 is a good number. As I like to point out, Allah loves the odd. This is in the Quran. So I always took that as a relief, being kind of odd, but I think it had to do with odd numbers were preferred over even numbers. And Zainab says, so is there more intention to the moment than attention on breath? I think that not more. Yeah, these are all really good questions, by the way.
Here's something I'm thinking about receptiveness, that it's not just that you try to pay attention to a thing, but what kinds of things are you ready to receive?
Yes.
There's a Lindsay Ellis piece, she's a movie analyst, about how hard it is to remember things from Michael Bay movies, because the movie throws so much stuff at you that it doesn't land very well. And I was thinking about, well, partly you need things coming to you at the right speed, not too fast, not too slow, but also what you can receive depends on your state. You know, some people have more flexibility on this than others.
Yes. Yeah, if you're doing very thin time slicing, Michael Bay movies are not as hard to understand as if your slices are very, very thick.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that I have discombobulated y'all just a little bit, got you thinking. Time is a very interesting subject. So if there are no further questions, I'm going to end the recording and begin to wrap things up for the evening. So thank you for coming. Commercials, the same stuff as you've heard 100 times before. Private sessions, I still have the special on. Kyle is getting ready to where you may be able to book a private session with her in the near future. She's got to finish all of this moving stuff and everything. We have things coming out. They will be announced. Buy our stuff. There's my commercial. And we will see you next week.